Hi and welcome back. It's Paul Tilley again, and we're talking about organizational markets. We've seen that there are three basic types of organizational markets, that being industrial markets, reseller markets, and government markets. And these three could actually operate as a global market as well. Now, what separates those types of markets, what we call organizational markets, from consumer markets? How are the two different? And what we're going to look at now is the major key differences to differentiate organizational from consumer markets. The first one that we need to understand is the concept of demand and how demand is different. Demand is said to be derived in organizational markets, and that means that organizational markets don't buy for the sake of buying. They buy because consumers down at the other end of the marketing channel are buying products. Take, for example, automobiles. You go and buy a new automobile off a lot. When that automobile is sold, the retailer has to put another automobile in the spot. So it goes and buys one from the manufacturer, who in turn will have to produce that car, who in turn will buy iron ore and steel to make that car, which in turn will result in more iron ore being dug out of the ground and creating employment. So demand is pulled through by the consumer ultimately buying the product. So this is what we call derived demand, and that's a first significant difference between consumer and organizational market. A second major issue in terms of organizational markets and how they differ is we look at the size of the order. You and I might go to Shoppers Drug Mart and buy a tube of toothpaste, but have you ever considered how many tubes of toothpaste Shoppers Drug Mart would buy from the manufacturer? Would they buy one? Would they buy two? Would they buy 1 million? Well, a store the size of Shoppers Drug Mart would buy in huge quantities in order to be able to fill all of their stores. So we say that in an organizational market, the size of the order is much greater than you or I would buy. So they're dealing in hundreds or boxes loads or container loads in terms of products. So it requires a significant amount more money, time, and effort to buy that huge quantity than when you and I go buy something. A third major issue is the buying objectives. How are the buying objectives different? When you or I would go buy something, we have some pretty good objectives. We need some clothes because we have to wear something. Well, how about a store? What are their objectives when they go buy things? Well, their objectives could be, for example, to make the most possible money. So they might want to buy the lowest priced, highest value product. Now, we could do that as consumers too, but stores tend to have very clear objectives, and normally they're related to making as much money as possible to be able to provide the service. And for nonprofits, where money is not really a big issue, a possible objective for them could be to be able to get the most value of the money they have or to minimize their costs. So that's another key issue that we find in terms of the difference between organizational and consumer markets. A next issue that we look at is the criteria is often different for manufactured products that industries buy amongst themselves. Our criteria when we go buy a car, for example, is I want a different color. I want a blue one. Yeah, that's about as far as our criteria go. However, organizations would have very well-established, formalized criteria. It has to be a certain price, it has to meet certain specification, it has to meet a certain delivery date, a certain production capacity, these sorts of things. So what we find is that in organizations, the criteria and the objectives are not only stated, but they're stated very clearly. And consumers, you don't necessarily find that to be a big feature. The next thing that we should look at in terms of the difference between a consumer market and an organizational market is that organizations tend to buy in huge quantities, as we've seen, so they tend to have a much stronger relationship with their buyers. You will go to a store and buy something, you may or may not know who's selling you the product, you may go there again, you may not. However, if companies such as Shoppers Drug Mart or Walmart go and buy products, they're buying huge quantities, they have formalized contracts with their suppliers. There's a lot of to and fro in order to buy those products. So as a result, the relationship is much stronger and it tends to be more formalized and legalistic. And oftentimes this relationship is mutual, meaning that the buyer will buy from the supplier and the supplier will buy from the buyer. And this is known as reciprocity, which is a mutual beneficial in terms of providing services. The final issue that we need to look at in terms of a difference between organizational buyers and consumer buyers is this concept of a buying center. A buying center is a buying department, really, of a firm. You or I would go buy something. We don't have a formal process for buying it. Most organizations, though, you have to go through the purchasing department in order to buy something. Like at the college, for example, I can't go buy this piece of equipment here. I have to go through purchase orders and these sorts of things. Most organizations are set up that way. So we have a buying center which formalizes the buying process. So that's our next section. And in summary, we need to think about organizations as having much stricter criteria, much stricter objectives, much bigger volumes, much greater relationship, and a demand that's derived based on consumer purchases. Okay, thank you.